The unstoppable force is run by people who are no smarter than us, who don't understand. They understand how to manipulate people, but they don't understand much more depth in human behavior. So it's not a problem that can't be overcome. We're dealing with humans. We're not dealing with an unstoppable machine, but although it feels often that way.
Hello and welcome. I'm Zara Setna, and this is the Collapse Life podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get started, please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons. So, we've been trained to see collapse as a spectacle, cities burning, markets crashing, armies moving. But suppose it comes more softly, wrapped in comfort, and delivered straight to your digital wallet. Dr. David Bell is a public health physician who spent years working inside the international development system, where entire communities lived on government stipends and foreign aid. So he saw what happened when survival is guaranteed, but purpose disappears. And now he warns that that same model is being imported into the West. So today we'll talk about what that transformation might mean for autonomy, meaning, and the future of free societies, and whether there's still a way to resist it. So, welcome to Collapse Life, Dr. Bell.
Thanks, Sarah. It's good
It's
to
so
be
nice
here.
to have you. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. This is a topic that truly concerns us. And there's a lot to wrangle with here. It's something that we've written about a few times on Collapse Life. But it's really interesting. You wrote an article recently and you talk about having worked in these communities. So I thought that might be a really good place to start for you to tell us about the communities where you worked, where people depended on the government for their payments or royalties for their survival. So tell us, what did you actually see on the ground? What does it look like for a community?
Yeah, so the communities I was writing about in that article that you looked at, particularly were North Australia, where you have, but this is common elsewhere. There are communities in Southeast Asia and particularly among ethnic minorities, but also Native Americans, and I think you'll understand that, where people, particularly their cultures, are overrun or wrecked, and so they find themselves in a situation where the sort of standards of living that they had had and the ways of living that they had had are no longer possible within where they're living, and they become dependent on an outside culture and outside people. And so you can't, if you can't hunt anymore, and if you want the trappings, as we all do, of clean water, electricity, etc., but you don't have the sort of connections and cultural background that makes that easy to attain for yourself. And so you end up in a situation, on communities where several communities where I worked, where people have been forced into a situation where they live in a house and do nothing essentially, and
Mhm.
there is not much to do. They receive money every month because a government, you know, quite rightly can't afford to have people starving. Yeah,
Yeah.
but they, you know, they don't have the sort of education and background or the culture in a way where you would work in a Western type job
Mhm.
that would provide money for that. And there are some important things sometimes with certain societies. If you, for instance, if you haven't gone through an agricultural revolution, you have a very different view of time, and it's not a superior or inferior view, but it's a very different view.
Mhm.
And so, if someone dies, you go off to that funeral and you don't stay in your job, etc. So you lose your job.
Yeah.
It's a different set of priorities. So they work in, say, Australia 200 years ago. They don't work in Australia well now,
Mhm.
and so you end up with communities that become dependent on welfare, either from the government or if there's uranium, etc., on your land, then you can become, you can get mining royalties.
Mhm.
But in the process, the men in particular, stop working and lose the ability to provide for their families and even the need, because if you can just go down to the shop and get the food, then you don't feel the need to get up in the morning and go and earn money to buy it. So you end up with a situation where this leads very clearly to a sort of loss of self-worth and dignity. And the family suffers from that. And, I lived on communities or worked with communities where the, children are literally extremely hungry, starving, diarrhea, etc. And the parents are elsewhere on drugs or drunk or whatever.
Mhm.
And I mean, I've seen this similar things actually in Western Melbourne, western suburbs of Melbourne as well, under Western. So he said this will come to the West. I mean, there are parts of society everywhere where people struggle in this way. But the, the problem is that this dependency then, in the sort of extreme form, the men then become violent because they're depressed and they become alcoholic and abuse drugs. The women suffer as a result and go down the same path, and then the children suffer. And
Mm.
the next generation has the same problem. There are communities I worked at where it was very different, where they had managed to develop industries such as tourist industries that were related to the original culture, and and they could keep drugs off and the communities, etc. And but the big difference was that they earned their own living and they had something to be proud of when they got up in the morning. And
Right.
we completely underestimate this. So uh, the UBI is important here. Essentially, they're on universal basic income, and universal basic income is just a subsidy or money for nothing.
Mhm.
And there is a movement, and a very strong one, that this should be rolled out to all of us, and it'll come as a form of central bank digital currency. And the reason for that will be because you cannot, the government doesn't want to give people money for tobacco or for alcohol. So you won't be able to use the money for that. You will only be able to use it for certain groceries and so on. We see this in the US now, where there's a push on how you can use food stamps, etc.
Right.
And that seems fine, and you can understand why that happens. But what you're doing is removing even further the ability of the person receiving that money to make decisions about their own life.
Mhm.
So you're actually exacerbating the underlying problem that made them often need to be reliant on UBI in the first place.
It's it's a really interesting conversation to be having right now because, as you say, this conversation about basic incomes has been picking up steam lately. And in fact, Silicon Valley has become very interested in it. So you
Mm,
actually hear people like Sam Altman and
yeah.
Elon Musk talking about it. And in fact, there have been numerous pilot studies of these kind of basic income programs, slightly different from what you just described, but nonetheless, just unconditional cash being given to families. One of the latest pilots actually was funded by Sam Altman of OpenAI, and you can again
Mm,
see, just like in the example that
yeah.
you described, the government of Australia couldn't afford to have people starve. Likewise, it's possible that Silicon Valley has taken such an interest in this because they know that they are making jobs obsolete in many ways and that people are going to be left with very little in terms of uh,
Mm,
employment opportunities, and therefore let's try this. But what you described is one way these things can play out. These pilot programs have all been quite short, but they seem to maybe take a little bit of pressure off of people who otherwise would be living in poverty, but they don't
mm,
really seem to spur entrepreneurship or business development or savings or anything like that. So I don't know if that's a cultural thing or if that it would be more just sort of a comment on the universal human condition, but just being given money doesn't necessarily equate to people. I think what the philosophy is that if you have your basic needs looked after, then you can
mm,
um, participate in creative endeavors or entrepreneurship or,
Yeah.
do all the things that you think you would do if you didn't have to go to your hack job.
Yeah, and you can build a fence because you've got time to build a fence, or you can learn a musical instrument. But you know when you're doing it that you're only doing it to fill in space. It's not something that's useful particularly. So the Silicon Valley people are very interested in this, partly because they are also producing the means that they hope will fill in the time. So that you have your Grok companion or your OpenAI companion, and you're playing video games and you're on a screen for 8 or 10 hours a day, and so that is good for them, and they will be happy to give people limited support so that they can do that, and the money will come, they know, directly back to them. But you're not giving anyone any fulfillment by doing that, and I don't think you really get fulfilled by just doing something to fill in space. So, you may grow some veggies for a while, but actually you can get the veggies far more easily just down the road at the shop for free. And most people will do that. So you'll get the odd person who, for some reason, will use this opportunity to do something creative and genuinely useful. But there aren't that many creative, genuinely useful things that we can all do apart from the sort of work that we do every day to support society. So you don't need everyone in a symphony orchestra, and you can't have everyone being an artist trying to sell paintings or an architect, because it just doesn't work. So already most people or a lot of people going through college in the US at the moment are not getting a job. It's something like 50% now struggle to get a job because we're already training people to do creative things that aren't useful for society and that we don't actually need or want. So there is something, I think, intrinsic in contributing to your family and having to get up and do something that's actually useful and actually helping others and helping yourself, and where you can see a future in it. So if you can't see a future, then immediate self-gratification is the way to go. So you will take alcohol, you'll take drugs, you'll sit on on computer games all day on a screen and spend 8 or 10 hours doing that. But if you can see that you can build a future for yourself and your family that would actually be really interesting over the next 10 to 20 years, then you won't do that because you know that you need to preserve yourself, and so that you can achieve what you think you dream or you think you have a chance of achieving. But if you have a situation where everyone is just assured of being looked after no matter what, then I think that unfortunately most people will just they will see that there is nothing really to build for. And they become depressed. You go from depression to substance abuse and so on, and that's the human path. And you get to a point where there's very little way of getting back. If you have those people supported by a digital currency where they are also restricted in what they can actually spend that on, that exacerbates the whole problem, because they just lose the ability even for their own decision making. And I've seen situations, for instance, where because the father in the family is spending money badly on drugs or alcohol or something, the money is then given to the mother so that the mother can spend it on the children. But in the process of doing that, it's the same thing. You take even the one role the father had, which was managing the money that is given, is now taken away. So you have someone who sees no usefulness in their life at all.
It's very despondent. I mean, we were just talking recently to Patrick Wood, who's quite an expert on technocracy,
Mm.
and one of the things I asked him was, why does it seem as though younger generations are embracing technocracy rather than sort of pushing back on it?
Mm.
And he had a very stark answer, which was that young people have no hope. They look to the future and
Yeah.
they see nothing in it for them. And I think that's very much what you're describing. And so if you see a
Yeah.
future
Exactly.
where you're not going to get a job, or the only job that you might be able to get is meaningless, um, you really can't afford to even get your own house, or make a
Yeah.
car payment, or let alone think about starting a business. What then else can you do? So yes, I will accept this idea that I'll get a monthly stipend and I can just be looked after, because what other alternative is there? And I wanted to get your comments on that thought, which is quite bleak, but also looking backward a little bit. Did we just go through a test run of that during
Mm.
COVID, when we were all shut up in our homes and told not to go out, not to interact with others? And we even received stimulus checks a couple of times just to kind of keep the engines running.
Yeah, I got a check in the mail, and I hadn't been expecting it during COVID, and I thought, why on earth am I getting this? I mean, I was fortunate; I still had some income. I know other people who completely lost their businesses and needed it. Yeah, I think in many ways it was a test run, and it was interesting to see how people reacted. So, we think that we would not be susceptible to that, but I would go to some of the few, when I was in Washington State, and there was a few restaurants or pubs that would still let me in, even though I hadn't had the government required injections. And I'll go with friends, and they would put on a mask at the door, and they'd take it off 20 feet away at the table, and I'd look at them and say, "Isn't that a stupid thing to do?" And they would get angry at me
Mm.
rather than agreeing. And you know, even though people knew that that it was intrinsically wrong and pointless, they still followed these dictates. People walked through the supermarket following the arrows and got angry if you walked against the arrow.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think in the response was very much nothing to do with public health.
Hmm.
So as we saw, even people like Fauci at the start of it, they clearly weren't on board, and they didn't understand that we were supposed to pretend that masks worked, and we were supposed to pretend that standing 6 feet apart makes a difference for an aerosolized virus. And they got the message, and they started telling us to do that. Um, so if it wasn't a public health response, then it was something else, and I assume it was some sort of conditioning, yeah, in a way an experiment. But I think it was just conditioning
Hmm.
towards getting people used to this approach. And we also saw, it was very stark in Canada with the truckers, obviously, where
Right.
when people push back against this in a organized fashion, then the government just stopped their ability to buy anything, which essentially did what CBDC, or central bank digital currency, would do to all of
Yeah.
us. And um, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most Canadians said nothing or supported it, because the truckers were putting their country at risk because the government had told them that the virus was bad.
Yes.
And so, yeah, that will absolutely happen again. And it'll now they have learned a lot, I think, about making it very difficult to resist this. So once the CBDCs do come, and they are, most West or all Western governments are working on this. Bank of International Settlements is working on it. The EU, I think it's 2029, they're going to introduce a digital currency, but there's forms of it coming here earlier. Um, if you protest against something that the government thinks is a bad thing, then you will not be able to buy groceries for the next month, or you will not be able to travel to any other protests. And um, you may even, for instance, have your children taken away because you're considered a bad influence on children. And I think most people in society, unfortunately, will just look the other way when this happens.
How would sorry, I just wanted to say, so some people will see the idea of basic income as a compassionate
mm,
intervention or even a humanitarian one. And how would you help them kind of go from that place of, we need this, there's a lot of inequality in the world, and why should we let people
mm,
suffer through the indignity and humiliation and all the physical effects of poverty? Why shouldn't the billionaires help the others by kind of
yeah.
redistribution? And how can you get them from that kind of point of view, which is rational and also compassionate, to helping them understand the sort of dystopian picture that you just painted?
Yeah, I mean, first you got to go back to basics a bit. Um, we are all equal, okay? And if each of us is a sovereign human being, if you believe that, then it's intrinsically wrong to put people, the slave master relationship is wrong. So anything leading in that direction is wrong. So if you're setting up society in a sort of feudal system where a few people at the top can decide through CBDC or whatever that what everyone else could do, where they can live, where they can protest, where they can't, what sort of groceries they can buy, how much sugar, how much whatever. If you're going down that road, then that's incompatible with basic human rights of each of us making our own decisions about our own lives. And we see that with healthcare, with vaccine mandates is a good example, I think. So just collecting my thoughts here, Zara. So just trying to get back to your question.
Helping people to understand that what can be framed in a narrative of compassion and humanitarianism can
Mm.
also lead us to essentially slavery.
Yeah, and we do need a safety net, and it is absolutely wrong that a government, I support the idea, for instance, of, which a lot of people don't have, universal health care and so on. There's a need to stop, to assist people when they're in dire straits,
Mhm.
and we should just do that. It's not, I don't think they have a right, an intrinsic right that everyone else has to do that, but as a decent society, we should want to do that.
Mhm.
Um, but there is also a need for all of us to then um, get over that bump in our lives and look after ourselves. And
Right.
if you build a society where that doesn't happen, then you're essentially enslaving those who work to help those who don't want to work. So, I mean, this is the tension that you always have with the social safety net.
Mhm.
So, and people will abuse a social safety net, and you have to accept a certain amount of abuse in order to support those who really need some sort of temporary support. But within that, if you're in a democracy, then you cannot have a situation where the government can start to use that social safety net to control how you think and how you act,
Right.
because it's incompatible with basic human rights. It's incompatible with a government that is there for the people rather than controlling the people.
Right. Right.
Uh,
But the same technocrats and Silicon Valley folks who are supporting UBI also would love to see the end of democracy as we know it anyway, and
yeah.
get getting rid of that. But just kind of going back to your idea of the social safety net and not letting people fall too far.
Mm,
I think that's something that you and I agree on, and that most people watching this would probably also agree on. The advocates of universal basic income would say that the tension between having that social safety net and letting people kind of abuse that system disappears with universal basic income because it's universal, it's unconditional, everybody gets it, and um, so everybody can use it as they choose to either sort out their basic needs, or if they don't, if their needs are already met, they can use it for whatever purpose they
mm.
want. So they say that this takes away a level of humiliation that's kind of baked into the needs based system that we have now, where people have to prove how needy they are in order to qualify for the benefit.
That money is coming from others for a start. Um, and if it's coming from billionaires with hundreds of billions of dollars in the bank, then there's a reason why they got that, and they got it from society as a whole. So if you're in a situation where UBI comes from these extremely rich people in Silicon Valley, there's a societal problem there with the amount of inequality that almost makes that possible.
Mhm.
And that's a problem that you need to solve rather than just then having them essentially become the lords over the rest of society.
Mhm.
So, I mean, UBI will come with strings attached. If it doesn't, you have this problem of most people will not work. The money comes from, in the end, from others, from all of us who are, those who are working. And so it's an intrinsically unequal and unfair basis for society where some people work and some people don't bother but are
Mhm.
still supported. So it could be a temporary measure, but it's an intrinsically unequal and unfair basis to run a society on. You have the problem that those people will inevitably, and I think they always do by and large, end up on a downward spiral psychologically because they lose their dignity as humans do, as we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
But also, it will come with strings attached because those billionaires or the government will see that they don't want to fund things that they don't like, and that's a human thing. So you're rebuilding the feudalism, which again is attractive in some ways. In that, it would be nice. Sometimes you think it's idyllic to just live in a little village in medieval England and have just go out into the fields and um, stick to your own people. The In reality, you're completely at the beck and call of those lords whenever they want to send you off to a battle or they want your daughter or whatever.
Right.
So we forget that when we are in that situation with an extremely unequal basis where you have lords and you have peasants, which is what really UBI is, then human behavior ends up with a massive amount of abuse of the peasants by the lords. And it doesn't matter what they look like now when they're talking about this. This has happened in every situation in human history where we've
Mhm.
had that sort of society.
And many would argue that's already where we are, UBI or
Mm,
not. We already have these lords who own everything, and we own very little. And what we do have
yeah.
is quickly being taken away from us. And as well, our purpose, as you said, is being taken away from us with everything being automated, and even the few jobs that there are to go around are now being kind
mm,
of phased out. There's some alarming projections of how many millions or billions of jobs will disappear over the next few
mm.
decades. So how do we solve for that sense of purpose if we don't
Yeah.
have jobs that give us meaning, that also give us social interaction, which I think is a very important and possibly overlooked
Mm.
part of going to work. It's very much where a lot of people find their social life, where
I
they
think it's
find their mates.
extremely important. Yeah. And
So,
again, in COVID, that was people were put in their homes and pubs were closed, etc. And there was an effort to stop people meeting and talking to each other. And
yeah.
that, yeah,
And that, I think that was a big part of the conditioning or the testing phase of
yeah,
COVID was getting us used to not being with each other, but not wanting to be with each other. I mean, what better thing than an
mm,
infectious virus to make us, be kind of almost disgusted by each other? I don't want to be around other
yeah.
people.
Or
They're going to make me sick. Disgusting.
people disgusted by people who didn't do what the government said and
Mhm.
get injected, for instance. And,
Right.
we lost friends over that. And I know lots and lots of people who didn't, whose families were split up over that. And
Yeah.
um, yeah, that is, that is the best way to impose control. Obviously, is to split up and divide the people in general. I think we
Right.
see a lot of that still today.
Yeah. I mean, that fight against feudalism is essentially why the United States was founded
Hmm.
as a place of liberty and self-direction. And it in a
Yeah,
very short period of time, we seem to have just obliterated that and gone back to a very 21st century um, new version of the old feudalism. Is it just that as humans, freedom is not a natural state or not something that will really succeed? Because it doesn't seem as though it should have
yeah,
ended up this way, and yet here we are.
yeah. So is it a cycle? And some people claim there's cycles. I think certainly the fight we're in now is not new, and we need to recognise that. Obviously, there are new tools, look like the screens that we're looking at now, but the idea of a very small minority trying to purloin all the wealth and power in society and use that against the majority is not, and use that to control the majority and even further increase their wealth. It is the default state, I think, of human society. So certainly for the last few thousand years since we've had countries and cities.
Right.
So I think we shouldn't be surprised. And there's never going to be a utopia where everything is completely different. It is always a fight. But I think over the last few decades, people have fought a lot less.
Mm,
Even simple things like, um, in Australia where I grew up, there was separation in media. You could only own, say, one TV station and two newspapers. And so, there was a reason for this because it was seen 50, 60, 80 years ago that you couldn't have two or three families essentially owning all the information flow in a society because that would be intrinsically against the idea of democracy and freedom.
right.
And during the 80s, 1980s, 1990s, this was broken down by the government, and these things were pushed away with the idea that, you know, the the more we let rich people get involved in society and run it, the more somehow business-like and effective and efficient it would be. And I think in the process, we sort of forgot what humans are supposed to be for and society is supposed to be for.
Right.
So the result of that is inevitably, as was predicted then, this increasing inequality. And we've seen a huge, if you look at the graphs on wealth in the Western countries over the last 50 years, there's a huge, the average person's ability to get by and survive is essentially static. and the few percent at the top have had a huge increase in wealth. So we have this rapidly increasing inequality.
Mhm.
And it's very hard to undo that because now these people have so much power, as we see in the US, where most people in Congress are heavily paid by the pharma industry, and a large proportion are heavily paid by the arms industry, and the same we see now with the software industry. So it's extremely difficult through the structures that we had in society to change the trajectory we're on,
Mhm.
because the structure we have to change it, which is the elected arms of government, is now more interested in doing the bidding of those who have the money to allow them to get elected than the electors themselves.
Yeah.
And because of the concentration of media ownership, that it's almost impossible for anyone else to get, as we saw in the past with Ron Paul and so on, but it's even more so now.
Yeah.
Any outsider, it's almost impossible for them to get in the mix and actually have an influence.
To break in, yeah.
Yeah.
And as you say, this is not necessarily entirely new. We've seen
Mm.
similar structures and huge inequality in the past. And history has shown us that in some of those instances, um, it was rebellion or revolution that was required in order to kind of break that cycle
Yeah.
at that time. And that pushes an entire population into chaos and
Yeah.
potentially destroys a lot of the social fabric that may have existed. What comes after that revolution is
Mm.
always a question mark. And
And there's
so
often at least a period with an even worse dictator. Yeah.
right. Right. Or and we've seen in say place like Iran where the revolution brought in
Mm.
potentially something worse than what was there before depending on your outlook
Yeah.
and that's going to be the case in the West as well.
And
But
obviously the
it's now
Soviet
gone on for
Union effect.
decades.
Yeah.
It's not there's been no chance for any kind of independent movement to come back up. So
Mm.
is that where we're headed?
That is the fear, isn't it? That it's going to be much, much harder. And there is a huge ability now to control. I was just looking yesterday at there's a post about there's a situation in North Carolina as an example where a family are at risk of losing their children because they haven't fully complied with, or that they're seen to have not fully complied with, a hospital's cancer treatment protocol. And there's a case you may have seen where parents were supposedly arrested in Texas a few months ago, I think from one of the northern New England states. And because they had decided they didn't want to vaccinate their children, as was mandated in that state, they took them to Texas. They're accused of kidnapping their children
Oh my
because
goodness.
their children are belong to the state, and
Lord,
therefore, if the
yeah.
parents take them away, they're kidnapped. And but this situation is not that uncommon, and um, if you can do that sort of thing, if you can say threaten to take away children, or you can threaten to um, even you decide what the children need, etc., then it's extremely difficult for people to oppose that.
Mhm.
So if you're going to have your credit cards cut off and you can no longer decide, take your family for a holiday or buy them the basic groceries you want or be seen as the breadwinner in your family, then it's extremely difficult for most people to go along with that and continue to oppose. But something like losing your children is, I think, one of the biggest ones.
Yeah.
And so once a government can do that, which they are now in this country and elsewhere, and increasingly so, then you have a control over society that most people can't break from.
Yeah. It's really horrifying. And there are certainly a small number of people who are talking about this, yourself included, and our audience as well. Very often, um, as we look to this sort of dystopian future
Mm,
where our ability to buy and sell can be shut off, or our ability to move around or travel can be shut off. Some of
mm,
the recommendations for a kind of a quiet rebellion are things like building your own economic sovereignty, or
yeah.
growing your own garden and putting up food, or developing parallel trade networks,
Mm.
to building your own skills so that you can barter with your neighbor, things like that. Do you see those as rational reactions, or is it more that we should just be building our own psychological sovereignty so that we can stay individual and sovereign even as we become physically slaves to a system?
Yeah, I think those things do help to build that psychological sovereignty. And, you know, we have a few acres and we eat a lot of our own food and we barter a bit and so on. But that could be closed down tomorrow if the government decided. And so it's not an alternative. I don't think it's possible to get out of the system because you're only out of it at the will of the authorities.
Right.
And then, that you close down as soon as they want to. But to get out of this, in the end, people have got to see freedom and as something that is not negotiable. And to do that, I think you've got to get beyond where we are now. You've got to see a future that is worth living.
Right.
So I think the way to get out in the end is going to be a very long course, and it sounds a bit woolly, but we need to sort of reclaim the idea of beauty, of music, of art, of good architecture, of enjoying nature, and these things. And this again is what was taken away a lot during COVID.
Yeah.
It's probably the only time in 2,000, 2,500 years in Western culture that live theatre was stopped,
Yeah.
and live music was stopped. It hasn't been done before, even during world wars and so on. So these are the things which make it worth living, and then make it worth fighting for, and avoiding the immediate self gratification of that having no future brings. And we need to have most people in society seeing that. I think the idea, if you look at modern architecture, you look at the way cities are built, or the way towns in my state of Texas are going, rural towns which are being gutted and the community gutted.
Yeah.
This is going the other way, and it's not building the sort of mindset where you want to fight for yourself and those around you.
Yeah.
And I think there's some deliberateness in this, or
Yeah.
at least a nonchalance, and people in charge don't want to address these problems because they see an advantage in having a community that doesn't have a heart. So I think in the end, we've got to sort of rebuild our culture in that way, and through that, we can then build a society that's strong enough to stand up against feudalism. And I think if you look at what happened in the French Revolution and so on, they didn't necessarily end up better in any of those revolutions. The Russians ended up under the Soviet Union under Stalin, etc.
Hmm.
Um, so we have to find a better way than that. But I think it's a long process of rebuilding our own culture.
Yeah. And again, valuing freedom, as you say, and seeing freedom as non-negotiable, um, but also recognizing that fighting for freedom is going to require some discomfort, some sacrifice. So
Yeah.
how do we raise a generation who have know nothing but ease and comfort? How do we help young people to value discomfort or sacrifice, because the end goal is freedom? If especially if you look at history and you see all these revolutions that actually caused a lot of pain in the short term and
Mm.
may gain centuries later when we're all long dead and gone.
Yeah, I don't think there's an easy answer to that. Yeah, how do we do that? I don't know, but we need to figure it out fairly quickly
Hmm.
because otherwise these younger generations are going to become trapped as we're talking, and then it's going to be increasingly difficult for them to break out. So I think that is where it is really different than where humanity's been in this situation in the past. So if they all become unemployed and desperate and hungry, then that'll be an incentive. But if they're given UBI and then what they can do is tightly controlled, that they have no chance of owning a house, they have no chance of perhaps even owning their own car, they have no chance of living where they want, but they will be able to have enough food this week if they do what the government says, then it's going to be very hard to get um, a lot of people to stand up. So I think that it is, although there's no quick, easy answer, we are stuck in a situation where we haven't got that much time either.
Right. Um, just as we close, just thinking back to those communities that you described at the top of this conversation, you described two different outcomes. One, pretty despondent, and one where
Mm,
the community actually did manage to kind of take control
yeah.
and set their own path. Was it just a question of opportunity where one town could potentially put in tourism where the other one couldn't? Or was there something different about those communities in terms of temperament or outlook or leadership?
Yeah, I'm sure there's no simple answer because these things are affected by local history and so on and so on. But there, there were strong men and women in those communities who sort of gathered people together and got them to work together. And so, there are always key individuals who you need in the community to help that
Yeah.
process. So I think that's probably the main difference.
Okay, that's I'm grateful for that insight, and I think it's probably a nice way to kind of bring this to a bit of a close, because I think it's a good example that there is something that we can do. There is some
Mm.
control that we can seize, even when we see this almost unstoppable force happening around us.
Yeah,
And
and the unstoppable force is run by people who are no smarter than us. Um, and who don't understand. They understand how to manipulate people, but they don't understand much more depth in human behavior. So it's not an um, it's not a problem that can't be overcome. We're dealing with humans. We're not dealing with um, an unstoppable machine. But although it feels often that way.
Mhm. So knowing that one of the strengths of these people who are pushing this on us is that they know how to manipulate people,
Mm.
then we should make ourselves as immune to manipulation and as ungovernable as possible.
Yeah, certainly ungovernable to those people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is by working together in large groups, and that's so in a way you're forming an alternative government perhaps, but you're not accepting the government that's being imposed.
Yeah. And just letting them know that we see what they're doing and we don't fall for it. I mean, all of
Yeah,
this sounds simpler than it may be in practice. But I think that having conversations like this, and you bravely sharing your experiences in that article that you wrote, I think is a really good way to help people at least see what's coming. And that's the whole purpose of inviting you to join us in this. Um, so
thanks.
thank you
Yeah,
for
thank
that.
you. Yeah,
Go
yeah,
ahead.
I mean, in a way I haven't got a choice. training. I'm a public health physician, and this is a the idea of social determinants of health and social capital and so on are intrinsic to public health. If people, the peasants die much sooner than those who have freedom, and that's a fact in most societies. So it's even from a public health point of view, I don't think we have a choice but to oppose what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Remind people where they can find that article that I just mentioned, and also where they can find the rest of your thoughts and your writings and your work.
Okay, yeah, most of what I've written is on Brownstone Institute. If you look up David Bell, author of Brownstone, or on the Daily Skeptic in the UK,
Mm-hmm.
they've
That's
been
where I saw
generous
your.
enough to publish. Yeah.
That's wonderful. What are you working on at the moment? Any thoughts rolling around in your head?
Uh, yeah, sort of. Actually, I've been writing for months. So it takes me a long time to write things, but I've been writing for months on just the idea, trying to understand what this sort of behemoth that we're facing is. And, it is people, but and it's not people sitting around a table sort of scheming. But there are institutions and groups who are involved in this, like the Trilateral Commission and the Bilderberg Group and so on. They're all real, and they do make decisions that sort of direct this. But it's trying to understand better what that is. I think is essential to overcome it. And I don't think many people have a handle. People rail against an individual like Bill Gates or rail against a WHO or whatever, but it is not those institutions, not those people. It's something much deeper in society, which and there's issues around society around the loss of religious belief, and religion can offer freedom or it can offer enslavement.
Mm-hmm.
So just religion isn't the answer, but the way we think about freedom and about what is worth thinking outside of ourselves. Are we just organic material? Are we
Right.
something that is much more than that?
Right.
And I think it comes back to understanding beauty, understanding music, and so on in the world, and seeing things in the world that are greater than immediate self gratification. And
Yes.
so I think that, this is all very much tied together. It's not. It sounds woolly, but it's
No.
fundamental to actually building a better society, overcoming the mess we're in at the moment.
Absolutely agree. It's something that we think about and talk about often is just removing that idea of anything that's transcendent and just,
Mm,
bringing us down to essential components that medicine and education and so many of
yeah,
these institutions have done, just brought us down to we're just little mechanical objects, and not that we have a divine spark and that we're connected to each other through something much greater than us. I think that's a really important point, so I'm glad that you made it.
yeah, and it's often couched as science, but it's not. I mean, science is a pursuit of truth. It's actually the same as religion in a way. It's a pursuit of truth,
Yes.
and so they're not incompatible. But the thing about science is you're always questioning. So if you've arrived at a point where you think you know all the answers, then you've left science and you've gone to dogma, which
Yeah.
is superstition, which is completely different.
Yeah. And if you are feeling as though the institutional forces do not allow you to question, then you know that there's a problem going,
Yeah,
because you have to question.
yeah,
That's how you learn or confirm the thing that's already known to be true. But you have to question it.
yeah. And if you don't, then you're sort of accepting that you haven't got intrinsic value and you're not equal. So
Right. Well, Dr. Bell, thank you so much for joining us here today and for
thanks,
all
sir.
that you do to help others understand what we might be giving up in the guise of safety or convenience. So we're very grateful, and we look forward to seeing what comes of your future analysis.
Okay, thanks, sir.
Thank you. And thank you to our viewers for sticking with us through this important conversation. If something in it struck a nerve, please be sure to share it with other people and encourage them to subscribe to Collapse Life on Substack or here on YouTube or wherever you might be watching us. If you want to help us keep exposing stories like this, please consider a paid subscription or a one-time gift via our Buy Me a Coffee page. We will be back next week with another exploration of how our world is changing and what we can all do about it. We hope to see you. And until then, keep your chin up. It's only collapse. See you soon.